The cylindrical stove glowed against the darkness like a beacon, its banded sections radiating orange heat into air so cold that breath turned to ice crystals before hitting the ground. Henrik Vinter stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the thermometer read -70 degrees Celsius while his fool's chimney burned steady and warm inside. 3 days earlier, the veteran trappers at the Hudson Bay post had laughed at his design and warned him it would kill him before spring arrived. Now those same men were dying in their cabins less than 10 miles away, their traditional stoves failing against cold that shattered metal and split living trees down to their roots. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and if you've ever experienced brutal winter cold like this. If stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more unexpected than this one. The laughter started before Henrik Vinter finished unrolling the sketch on the worn trading post table. 6 trappers crowded around the rough paper, their breath visible in the cold air of the Hudson Bay Company outpost. It was January 18th, 1842, and the annual midwinter gathering had drawn men from trap lines scattered across 200 miles of Canadian wilderness. Henrik had walked 4 days through snow to reach this meeting, carrying his drawings and a desperate need to share what he had discovered. The reaction was not what he had hoped for. "That's your grand invention?" said Marcus Webb, a grizzled trapper who had survived 15 winters in the territory. "Looks like a stack of barrels with holes punched in them." Henrik pointed to the detailed cross-section he had labored over by candlelight. "The bands create layers. Each one radiates heat outward while the center column maintains the fire. The air flows between the sections, warming as it rises. It uses half the wood of a traditional stove and produces 3 times the usable heat." "Usable heat," Webb repeated, shaking his head. "Son, heat that escapes into your cabin instead of going up a proper chimney is wasted heat. That's basic knowledge. You're Norwegian, so maybe they do things backward in the old country, but here we build chimneys that draw. Yours would fill your cabin with smoke in 10 minutes. Another trapper, a Scotsman named Douglas Reed, tapped the drawing. "And these exposed metal sections, in serious cold, that metal will suck heat right out of your cabin. Metal conducts. It doesn't insulate. You're basically building a heat sink that will freeze you faster than no stove at all." Henrik had anticipated these objections. He had spent months working through the principles, testing materials, observing how heat moved through different configurations. The metal conducts heat outward from the fire. That is exactly the point. The bands radiate warmth in all directions. A traditional stove loses most of its heat straight up the chimney. Mine keeps it in the living space. "Your mind will kill you," Webb said flatly. "I've seen men try clever modifications before. They always go back to what works, assuming they survive the experiment. Traditional stoves and chimneys have kept trappers alive for decades because they function properly. They draw smoke out and provide steady heat. Your contraption violates every principle of safe winter heating." The other men nodded in agreement. One called it the Fool's Chimney. The name stuck immediately, repeated with increasing amusement as the group dispersed to other conversations. Henrik carefully rolled up his drawings, his face neutral but his hands tight on the paper. He had known this would be difficult. Convincing practical men to trust an untested design was perhaps impossible. But he also knew something these veterans did not. He had already built it. The Fool's Chimney was installed in his cabin 30 miles north, and it worked exactly as he had calculated. They would learn. The winter would teach them. Henrik left the trading post the next morning without another word about his invention. Henrik had not always been obsessed with heating systems. When he arrived in the Canadian wilderness in the fall of 1840, he was simply another Norwegian immigrant seeking fortune in fur. He had partnered with a French-Canadian trapper named Philippe Marchand, a man with 8 years of experience who knew the territory and the trade. Philippe had assured Henrik that survival was straightforward if you followed established practices. Build a solid cabin, stock enough firewood, maintain your equipment, trust the methods that had kept men alive for generations. Henrik had believed him completely. Their cabin sat on the northern shore of a lake, 60 miles from the nearest trading post. The structure was standard for the region. Notched logs, clay chinking, a stone fireplace with a proper chimney, and a single room measuring 12 feet by 14 feet. They had cut and stacked 8 cords of firewood before the first snow. Philippe had pronounced their preparations excellent. They settled in for winter trapping, with confidence born from Philippe's experience and Henrik's willingness to learn. The cold arrived in late November. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, then -30, then lower. Philippe assured Henrik this was normal. Their fireplace consumed wood steadily, and they maintained a comfortable interior temperature by feeding logs every few hours. The system worked exactly as Philippe had described. Henrik learned to read trap lines in deep snow, process pelts properly, and manage the daily routines of winter survival. By January, he felt competent and secure. On January 9, 1841, the temperature dropped to -52 degrees Celsius. Henrik had never experienced cold like this. The air felt solid. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Their carefully stacked firewood disappeared into the fireplace at an alarming rate. Philippe began rationing their supply, calculating whether they had enough to last until the cold broke. The fireplace roared constantly, consuming 4 times the normal amount of wood, yet the cabin interior hovered barely above freezing. Frost formed on the inside walls. Water froze solid in its bucket within an hour of being brought inside. On the 3rd day of extreme cold, Henrik woke before dawn to add wood to the fire. Philippe was still in his bedroll near the fireplace, the warmest spot in the cabin. Henrik called his name. Philippe did not respond. Henrik crossed the frozen floor and touched his partner's shoulder. The body was cold and rigid. Philippe Marchand had frozen to death less than 6 feet from an actively burning fire. Henrik spent that day in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. The fireplace still burned. Wood still crackled and produced flames. Heat still rose up the chimney, but somehow it was not enough. Philippe had followed every established practice. The cabin was well built. The fireplace functioned properly. The wood was dry and burned hot. Yet a man had died from cold while lying next to an active fire. Something was fundamentally wrong with the system everyone trusted. Henrik buried Philippe when the ground thawed in April. By then, his obsession with understanding heat had already begun. Spring came late in 1841, but Henrik barely noticed. While other trappers prepared for the summer trading season, he remained at his cabin conducting experiments that would have seemed mad to anyone watching. He built small fires and observed how heat moved. He tested different materials by holding them near flames and measuring how quickly they warmed. He fashioned crude thermometers from mercury and glass tubes traded at the post. His trap lines went unchecked for weeks. The pelts he had collected sat unprocessed. All of his attention focused on a single question: why? Had Philippe died next to a working fire? The answer revealed itself gradually through observation and failure. Traditional fireplaces and stoves sent most of their heat straight up the chimney. This was considered proper function because it created draft, which pulled smoke out of the living space. But Henrik realized the draft was simultaneously pulling the warmth away. In moderate cold, enough residual heat remained in the cabin to maintain livable temperatures. In extreme cold, the heat loss through the chimney exceeded the heat retained in the room. The fire could burn continuously while the cabin froze. Henrik began sketching alternative designs in a journal he had started keeping. He drew systems with multiple chambers, configurations that captured rising heat before it escaped, arrangements that maximized surface area for radiation. Most of his ideas were impractical or impossible to build with available materials, but the exercise taught him principles. Heat rises, metal conducts, surface area matters. Airflow can be controlled and directed. Radiation travels in all directions from a hot surface. By midsummer, Henrik had developed a theory. If he could create a heating system that radiated warmth outward from multiple surfaces while still venting smoke safely, he could retain far more usable heat than a traditional fireplace or stove. The key was separating the functions. Traditional designs combined everything: fire, smoke management, and heat production all happened in one vertical column optimized for draft. Henrik envisioned a system where the fire burned in a central core, smoke vented through a controlled channel, and heat radiated from multiple horizontal bands surrounding the core. He spent the fall gathering materials: iron bands salvaged from broken barrels, sheet metal purchased at exorbitant cost from the trading post, rivets and bolts, fire brick for the internal core, sand for insulation between layers. The other trappers thought he was preparing for some elaborate steel or metalworking project. Henrik did not correct their assumptions. He had learned from Philippe's death that explaining unconventional ideas to conventional men was pointless. By late October, Henrik had assembled everything he needed. The design existed in detailed drawings with measurements and specifications. The material sat stacked in his cabin. The theoretical principles seemed sound based on his months of observation and testing. But theory and practice were different realms. He had never built anything remotely like this. He had no formal training in metalwork or engineering. He was attempting to create a heating system that contradicted everything experienced trappers knew about winter survival. If he was wrong, he would die exactly as Philippe had died. But if he was right, he might save lives. Construction began on November 1st. The central core came first. Henrik constructed a cylindrical firebox from firebrick, 18 inches in diameter and 4 feet tall. This would contain the actual flames and protect the outer structure from direct fire damage. He sealed the bricks with clay mixed with sand, creating joints that could withstand extreme heat without cracking. The firebox took 6 days to complete. Each brick had to be shaped by hand with a chisel because he had no proper masonry tools. His fingers bled from the work, but the finished core was solid and true. The first metal band went around the firebox with a 3-inch gap. Henrik fabricated it from iron barrel hoops he had straightened and riveted together. The band stood 14 inches tall and featured 12 ventilation holes drilled at precise intervals. These holes would allow hot air from the firebox to enter the gap and circulate. He supported the band with iron brackets bolted to the firebox at 4 points. The gap between the firebox and the band created an air chamber that would heat up and radiate outward. This was the fundamental principle of his design: multiple heated surfaces radiating in all directions. The second band went outside the first with another 3-inch gap. Then a third band, then a fourth. Each layer required careful measurement and alignment. The bands had to be perfectly vertical and evenly spaced. Any variation would create hot spots or dead zones where air could not circulate properly. Henrik worked from sunrise until his hands became too numb to hold tools, then resumed at first light the next day. The cabin filled with metal shavings and the smell of iron and smoke from his test fires. The smoke management system proved most challenging. Henrik needed to vent combustion gases without creating the powerful draft that pulled heat away in traditional chimneys. He designed a narrow flue pipe that ran up through the center of the firebox and exited through the cabin roof. The pipe was only 4 inches in diameter, much smaller than a standard chimney. This restricted flow meant smoke evacuation would be slower, but heat retention would be dramatically better. He wrapped the lower section of the flue with sheet metal to create a heat exchanger that warmed air in the outermost band. Installation required cutting a hole in his cabin roof and fabricating a weatherproof collar. Henrik worked through 2 snowstorms to complete the roof penetration, sealing it with tar and canvas. The entire assembly stood 5 feet tall from floor to the point where the flue entered the ceiling. It weighed approximately 200 pounds. It looked nothing like any heating device anyone in the territory had ever seen. On November 23, 1841, Henrik loaded the firebox with kindling and lit the first test fire. Smoke rose through the flue and exited cleanly. The metal bands began warming within minutes. After 2 hours, all 4 bands glowed with radiant heat. The cabin interior reached a comfortable temperature using half the wood a traditional fireplace would have consumed. Henrik stood back and studied his creation. The trappers would call it foolish, but Philippe Marchand would still be alive if this had existed 1 year earlier. Henrik arrived at the Hudson Bay Company trading post on January 16, 1842. The annual midwinter gathering brought trappers from across the territory to trade pelts, purchase supplies, and share information about trap lines and conditions. It was the one time each year when isolated men could exchange knowledge and learn from each other's experiences. Henrik brought his drawings because he believed the Fool's Chimney, though he did not yet know it would be called that, represented knowledge worth sharing. He had tested the system for nearly 2 months. It worked flawlessly. He genuinely thought other trappers would want to understand it. The mockery at the table was only the beginning. Word of Henrik's strange heating contraption spread through the trading post within hours. Men sought him out specifically to hear about it, then laughed openly when he tried to explain the principles. A trapper named William Hurst told Henrik that he was going to die because hot metal in a cabin created fire hazards that no amount of clever design could eliminate. Another man, a veteran of 19 winters named Samuel Cork, said the design violated basic thermodynamics and that Henrik clearly did not understand how heat worked. You are essentially building a metal tower that will conduct cold from outside into your living space, Cork explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow student. Metal is a conductor. In extreme cold, that metal surface area you are so proud of will become a liability. It will radiate cold inward just as efficiently as you claim it radiates heat. You have created an elaborate device that will kill you faster than simply sleeping outside. Henrik tried to explain that the fire kept the metal hot, that the bands were insulated from exterior cold by the cabin walls, that he had actually tested this and measured the results. His explanation sounded defensive and uncertain even to his own ears. The technical details that made perfect sense in his cabin seemed inadequate when confronted by the collective skepticism of experienced men. These trappers had survived conditions that killed weaker men. Their methods were proven. Henrik's methods were untested outside his own isolated cabin. Douglas Reed, the Scotsman who had criticized the design at the table, found Henrik later that evening. "I do not say this to be cruel," Reed said quietly, "but men die in the wilderness when they stop trusting what works. Your partner froze last winter. That is a tragedy. But the solution is not to abandon proven heating methods for experimental devices. The solution is to stock more firewood and build better fires. Traditional stoves have kept men alive for generations. Your contraption is answering a question nobody asked." Henrik left the trading post the next morning. He purchased minimal supplies and declined invitations to join group traplines in the spring. The 4-day walk back to his cabin gave him time to reconsider his certainty. Perhaps the experienced trappers were right. Perhaps he had let grief cloud his judgment. Perhaps the fool's chimney worked only under specific conditions that would not hold in true crisis. But when he arrived home and saw the steady glow of the banded metal warming his cabin, doubt faded. He knew what he had built. The temperature began dropping on January 19, 1842, the day after Henrik returned from the trading post. By evening, it had reached -30 degrees Celsius, cold but not unusual for the season. Henrik loaded the fool's chimney with birchwood and settled in to process beaver pelts by lamplight. The banded stove radiated steady warmth throughout the cabin. He burned 4 logs that evening, far less than the 8 or 10 a traditional fireplace would have consumed to maintain the same interior temperature. The system was working exactly as designed. By January 21st, the temperature had dropped to -45 degrees. Henrik could hear trees cracking in the forest as sap froze and expanded inside the trunks. The sound carried for miles in the still air, sharp reports like distant gunfire. Ice crystals hung suspended in the atmosphere, creating halos around the moon. This was serious cold, the kind that killed careless travelers and tested even well-prepared trappers. Henrik added an extra log to the fool's chimney, each feeding cycle, and monitored the interior temperature carefully. The cabin remained comfortable. The metal bands glowed orange at their hottest points. He was burning 6 logs per evening instead of 4, still far below what traditional heating would require. January 22nd brought -55 degrees. Henrik's breath crystallized instantly when he stepped outside to retrieve firewood from his covered stack. The air burned his lungs. Exposed skin froze in less than 1 minute. He had experienced cold like this only once before, during the winter that killed Philippe. The memory was sharp and terrifying, but this time was different. The fool's chimney burned steadily, maintaining an interior temperature of 15 degrees Celsius with manageable wood consumption. Henrik calculated his remaining firewood supply. He had 4 cords stacked and covered. At current burn rates, he could maintain heat for 6 weeks, even if the extreme cold persisted. He was safe. Other trappers in the territory were not as fortunate. Traditional stoves and fireplaces struggled against the extreme cold. The powerful drafts required for proper smoke evacuation pulled enormous amounts of heat out of cabins. Men burned wood at unsustainable rates, trying to maintain livable temperatures. Cabins that had seemed well prepared found their firewood supplies vanishing in days instead of weeks. Some trappers began burning furniture and spare lumber. Others abandoned their trap lines entirely and started moving toward the trading post, hoping to find shelter and supplies. Henrik did not know any of this yet. His cabin sat isolated, 30 miles from his nearest neighbor and 60 miles from the trading post. He had no communication with other trappers and no way to know what was happening across the territory. He simply maintained his routines, checking trap lines when possible, processing pelts, and keeping the fool's chimney burning. On the evening of January 22nd, he recorded the temperature in his journal, -58 degrees Celsius outside, 14 degrees inside. Wood consumption, 7 logs. Cabin warmth, excellent. He did not write that the test was coming, but it was. The coldest night in 20 years would arrive within 12 hours. The pounding on Henrik's door came at 3 in the morning on January 23rd. He woke instantly, disoriented and alarmed. Nobody traveled in the wilderness at night, especially not in extreme cold. The pounding came again, weaker this time, accompanied by a voice too muffled to understand. Henrik grabbed his rifle and crossed the cabin floor. The interior was warm despite the late hour. The fool's chimney glowed softly in the darkness, radiating heat from all 4 bands. He pulled the door open 6 inches, keeping the rifle ready. Marcus Webb collapsed inward across the threshold. The veteran trapper who had mocked Henrik's design at the trading post now lay semi-conscious in the doorway, ice-coating his beard and eyebrows. His hands were bare and frozen white. His coat was inadequate for the conditions outside. Henrik pulled him inside and slammed the door against the cold that rushed in behind him. The thermometer mounted outside his window read -70 degrees Celsius. Henrik had never seen a temperature that low. He was not certain thermometers were even accurate at such extremes. Webb was barely coherent. Henrik stripped off the frozen outer clothing and wrapped him in blankets near the fool's chimney. The radiant heat from the metal bands began working immediately, warming Webb's core without the direct contact that could damage frozen tissue. Henrik heated water for tea and forced the liquid between Webb's lips. After 20 minutes, Webb's shivering became more regular and his eyes focused. After 40 minutes, he could speak in broken sentences. His story came out slowly. The extreme cold had descended faster than anyone anticipated. Webb's cabin was 11 miles southeast of Henrik's location. His traditional fireplace had functioned normally for the first hours of the evening, consuming wood rapidly but maintaining adequate heat. Around midnight, something changed. The chimney draft became erratic. Smoke backed into the cabin. Webb opened the flue damper wider to increase draft, which worked temporarily but pulled even more heat out of the cabin. The interior temperature dropped below freezing despite the roaring fire. Webb made a desperate decision. He would walk to Henrik's cabin through the night rather than freeze to death next to a malfunctioning fireplace. The journey should have killed him. 11 miles in -70-degree cold, through snow and darkness, without proper gear, Webb had survived only because he knew the route perfectly from years of experience and because some survival instinct kept him moving when his body wanted to stop. He had walked for nearly 4 hours. His hands and feet were frostbitten. His face showed tissue damage from exposure. But he was alive, sitting in a cabin that maintained a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, while the world outside reached temperatures that shattered metal and split living wood. Webb stared at the fool's chimney for a long time without speaking. The banded metal glowed orange and red in the darkness. Heat radiated outward in waves that warmed the entire cabin space evenly. The firebox consumed wood at a steady, manageable rate. There was no roaring draft, no smoke backup, no desperate struggle to maintain heat. The system worked. Webb finally spoke 4 words that would change everything. "You were right, Henrik." Webb recovered enough strength by dawn to walk around the cabin. His frostbite was serious but not life-threatening. Henrik treated the damaged tissue with grease and clean cloth, standard frontier medicine that prevented infection if not further injury. Webb studied the fool's chimney with the focused attention of a man whose life had been saved by something he had previously dismissed. He walked around the device multiple times, examining the bands, the gaps between them, the firebox, the narrow flue pipe. He asked technical questions. Henrik answered carefully. By mid-morning, Webb understood the basic principles. By afternoon, He was explaining them back to Henrik with the enthusiasm of a convert. The second arrival came on January 24th. Douglas Reed appeared at the door near sunset, accompanied by two younger trappers named Thomas Kirkland and James Pratt. Their story was similar to Webb's. Reed's cabin was 15 miles northwest. His traditional stove had failed under the extreme cold. Rather than freeze, Reed had gathered the two younger men from nearby trap lines and led them toward Henrik's location. The journey had taken most of the day. All three showed signs of exposure. All three recovered in the radiant warmth of the Fool's Chimney. On January 25th, 4 more men arrived. They had heard from other trappers that Henrik's cabin remained warm despite conditions that made other shelters uninhabitable. The news was spreading through the wilderness in the desperate way information travels during crisis. Henrik's small cabin now housed 8 men in a space designed for 1. They slept in shifts, shared food from combined supplies, and maintained the Fool's Chimney constantly. Henrik became the de facto expert, teaching the others how to load the firebox properly, how to adjust airflow, how to recognize when the metal bands reached optimal temperature. The technical explanations happened organically. Reed asked why the narrow flue pipe did not create smoke backup. Henrik explained that the restricted flow meant lower draft velocity, which reduced heat loss while still evacuating combustion gases effectively. The key was balance. Too much draft pulled heat away. Too little draft caused smoke problems. The 4-inch flue diameter created exactly the right restriction. Kirkland asked why the metal bands did not freeze the cabin, as Samuel Cork had predicted at the trading post. Henrik explained that the bands were inside the insulated cabin walls, surrounded by warm air, and constantly heated by the firebox. They never experienced exterior cold. The metal conducted heat outward from the fire, not inward from outside. The young trapper, James Pratt, asked the most important question: how much wood does this use compared to a regular stove? Henrik had tracked this carefully. The Fool's Chimney consumed approximately 40% of the wood a traditional fireplace required to maintain equivalent interior temperature in extreme cold. The difference was dramatic. A trapper with 5 cords of firewood could survive twice as long with Henrik's design. In a winter where wood supplies were being depleted at catastrophic rates, that efficiency meant the difference between life and death. The 8 men crowded into Henrik's cabin understood this completely. They had walked through lethal cold to reach the one shelter that worked. The Fool had become the teacher. The extreme cold broke on February 2nd, 1842. Temperatures rose to -20 degrees Celsius, which felt almost warm after 2 weeks of unprecedented cold. The 8 men sheltered in Henrik's cabin began planning their return to their own trap lines and cabins. Webb and Reed insisted on staying extra days to document the Fool's Chimney design in detail. They measured every dimension, noted every specification, and filled notebooks with sketches and instructions. Henrik answered questions patiently, explaining not just what to build, but why each element mattered. The true cost of the cold wave became clear when trappers gathered at the Hudson Bay Company post in early March. 14 men had died across the territory. Some froze in their cabins when firewood supplies ran out. Others died attempting to reach shelter through impossible conditions. 3 disappeared entirely, their bodies not found until spring thaw revealed frozen remains along trap lines. The survivors traded stories of malfunctioning stoves, desperate wood consumption, and near-death experiences in temperatures that exceeded anything in living memory. Every man who had sheltered in Henrik's cabin survived without serious injury. This fact did not go unnoticed. Webb told the story repeatedly, describing how Henrik's strange contraption had maintained comfortable heat while traditional systems failed catastrophically. Reed brought his detailed drawings and specifications, spreading them on tables for other trappers to examine. The mockery from January was gone, replaced by intense practical interest. Men who had laughed at the Fool's Chimney now asked technical questions about construction methods and material requirements. Samuel Cork, who had confidently predicted Henrik's death, approached him directly on the second day of the gathering. "I was wrong," Cork said without preamble. "I did not understand what you were attempting. My cabin burned wood faster than I could cut it during the cold. I nearly died next to a working fireplace, same as happened to your partner. Will you teach me to build one of these?" Henrik spent the next week conducting informal classes at the trading post. Groups of trappers gathered while he explained the principles of radiant heat, controlled draft, and efficient combustion. He emphasized that the fool's chimney was not magic, but applied physics. Heat rises, metal conducts, surface area radiates, restricted flow reduces heat loss. The concepts were simple once explained. The implementation required care and precision, but any competent trapper could manage the construction with proper guidance. The Hudson Bay Company factor, a pragmatic administrator named Robert Morrison, recognized the significance immediately. He commissioned a detailed technical report on the fool's chimney design and distributed copies to company posts throughout the Northern Territories. He also purchased the right to manufacture prefabricated band kits that trappers could assemble themselves, compensating Henrik with trade goods and credit. Henrik accepted reluctantly. He had not invented the system for profit. But Morrison argued that standardized components would save lives by making adoption easier. Henrik could not dispute that logic. By late March 1842, 17 trappers had committed to building fool's chimneys before the next winter. The design that had been mocked in January was now being recognized as the innovation that would define cold weather survival throughout the Northern Territories. The adoption of Henrik's heating system spread rapidly through the Northern Territories during 1843 and 1844. Trappers who had built fool's chimneys reported dramatic improvements in fuel efficiency and winter comfort. More importantly, they survived cold snaps that would have killed them with traditional heating. The design underwent natural evolution as different builders adapted it to local materials and specific needs. Some versions used copper bands for superior heat conduction. Others incorporated stone mass for heat retention. The fundamental principles remained constant: multiple radiating surfaces, controlled draft, and efficient combustion within an insulated firebox. The name evolved from mockery to respect. Fool's chimney became Vinter stove in most contexts, though old-timers still used the original term with affection rather than derision. Hudson Bay Company posts began stocking prefabricated band kits and standardized components. By 1846, an estimated 47 Vinter stoves were operating across the Canadian wilderness. Company records documented a measurable decrease in trapper mortality during severe winters. The correlation between stove adoption and survival rates was undeniable. Henrik continued trapping until 1848, when he sold his territory rights and relocated to a small settlement near Lake Superior. He married a widow named Catherine Bergstrom in 1849 and worked as a carpenter and occasional metalworker. He built Vinter stoves on commission for new settlers and taught construction techniques to anyone interested. He never promoted himself as an inventor or sought recognition beyond his local community. When people thanked him for saving lives with his design, he always mentioned Philippe Marchand and said the innovation belonged to the winter that taught him. The technical legacy extended beyond individual survival. Military outposts in northern regions adopted Vinter stove principles for barracks heating. Remote scientific stations used modified versions for reliable warmth in Arctic conditions. Gold rush prospectors in the Yukon during the 1890s built crude versions from salvaged materials. The core insight that heat retention matters more than heat generation influenced heating system design across multiple contexts. Modern efficient wood stoves still employ variations of Henrik's radiating band concept, though few users know the origin. Henrik Vinter died in 1868 at age 53 from pneumonia. He left behind a wife, 3 children, and a modest estate that included carpentry tools and metalworking equipment. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his skill as a craftsman, but made no reference to the fool's chimney or the lives saved by his innovation. Only the trappers and northern settlers who had used his stoves understood what Henrik had accomplished. They preserved the knowledge through practical application rather than formal documentation. Several Vinter stoves survived into the 20th century. Museums in Canada and the northern United States maintain examples as artifacts of frontier innovation. The banded metal design looks strange to modern eyes, almost primitive, until you understand the principles behind it. Then it becomes clear that Henrik Vinter solved one of wilderness survival's fundamental problems, not with new technology, but with existing materials used intelligently. The fool had built something impossible, a heating system that worked when everything else failed, and in doing so, proved that sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from tradition, but from refusing to accept that better solutions cannot exist.